Okay, so today's lecture is on equality and disorder. Thomas Hobbes. Perhaps the best known political philosopher on the subject of order and anarchy is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' central thesis in the Leviathan is that human beings under conditions of complete liberty and equality will descend into a condition of perpetual warfare. Only the creation of an artificial sovereign power, namely government, can help us avoid this terrible anarchy. So Hobbes begins with an account of human beings and the basic circumstances they face in life. And one might ask oneself, why start with that? Well, we're building a government for human beings, and if we're going to do that, we need to know what sorts of creatures they are. Human beings are reasoning, calculating creatures, according to Hobbes. They are endowed with senses with which to perceive the world, they have desires, and they have aversions. These are the sorts of creatures we are talking about. Hobbes then proceeds to deduce some basic conclusions based on how human beings typically are and the sorts of circumstances they find themselves in. So, for example, he observes that humans call good what pleases them and evil what displeases them. He concludes that in nature, moral judgment is unavoidably private. Each of us has our own moral judgment about things, and we'll see shortly that this leads to conflict. Another observation is that we're all roughly equal, or rather, we are all roughly equally physically vulnerable to one another. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're all equally strong. Obviously, in a fair fight, a larger, more powerful individual might certainly be expected to prevail over a smaller, weaker individual. However, human beings, first of all, have developed tools, and tools can be equalizers. So guns, for example, can be wielded by people of varying physical sizes and certainly tend to negate size advantages. But also human beings can cooperate. They can band together. So several physically weaker people can overcome one larger, stronger person. And finally, the circumstances of our life are that we find ourselves in vulnerable situations. We find ourselves at various times naked or asleep, and under those circumstances we can be overcome. And so the conclusion that he draws is that no human being can avoid worrying about physical safety, right? We are not gods, and we are not animals, perhaps, although animals in some sense may be said to worry about physical safety. We really think about physical safety. We calculate and reason about our physical safety in ways that perhaps animals don't do as much. So human beings are creatures who worry about physical safety, and no human being can avoid doing so. A third observation is that we're all close to equal in mental faculties. Again, it doesn't mean that we're all equally intelligent, far from that, but it means that on the whole, human beings are generally unwilling to recognize the superior wisdom of others. Right? We're generally not willing to defer to other people on either questions of practical questions or on moral questions. So, the argument roughly goes as follows. Physical and mental equality means that we all have hopes of obtaining scarce goods. These scarce goods might be things like mates, money, status, there could be others. But the point is that these goods are scarce relative to the people who want them. And in the case of status, they are literally scarce. There can only be one number one, right, in any given field. Now, because we are all aware that each of us have these hopes, this makes us what Hobbes calls diffident, which is an old word for distrustful. So we're distrustful of one another because we are all aware that each of us has these hopes, and we're all aware that nobody is so amazingly stronger or better than another that they can be guaranteed of getting it. And so fear plus scarcity equals conflict, inevitably, for Hobbes. So he concludes that natural equality, the rough natural equality of human beings, is actually a major source of human conflict. Equality, or more properly, the lack of any obvious information about natural superiority among human beings, is really a problem. Insecurity, allied with an instinct for self-preservation among human beings, leads to the drive to seek security through power. And of course, all are similarly insecure. So, no one is so superior to anyone else that they have nothing to fear. So a second conclusion would be that man's natural state of freedom and equality is a state of war. And this natural state he calls the state of nature. The state of nature is a place where no restraints exist except the equal restraints of all other people acting independently as independent agents. So the state of nature is an ugly place, a place that people would fervently like to escape if they could. However, on their own, they can't. They're stuck, since even if they on their own try not to harm others, they get no assurances that others will not harm them. Anytime there is no overarching enforcer, men are in a state of war for Hobbes. And that's true even if they don't know it. Anytime they have a good reason not to fight, which roughly means that the cost of war is clearly to everyone higher than the benefit of engaging in conflict, then they are at peace. The main problem with the state of nature is not so much that people behave badly or are bad. It's that given what they know about how other people are, they have to act as if others are bad. They may often have to do violence before violence comes to them. Hobbes therefore envisions the state of nature as a pretty awful place. No commerce, no industry, no capital investments, no savings, and continual fear of danger and death. Right? You can imagine, why produce anything? Why trade anything? Why produce anything if others are just going to steal it? Why try to trade things if other people are going to try and swindle you in trading? Why invest for the future if that can be taken away at any time? So at the end of the day, the lack of security of the state of nature makes this place a really terrible place to live. Hobbes' famous quote about the state of nature starts or finishes, "In the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Right? Not nasty, British, and short. Well, I had one student say, nasty, brutish, and short. So, our natural equality, as we've just seen, is deeply problematic for Hobbes, so much so that in order to solve this problem, we have to create an inequality so great that no one can challenge it. This is the only way to secure peace and a chance at happiness and human flourishing. So, put simply, if equality is the problem, then inequality has to be the solution. And more specifically here, an inequality of both physical and moral authority that combats our natural equality of physical and moral private judgment in the state of nature. So the only way to solve the problem of natural equality is to create an authority, by creating a power to overawe all others. Maybe we could use a ring. But if we don't have a ring, Hobbes calls this power the sovereign, which we might call the government. He thought a sovereign, and he symbolized this in the 17th century as an absolute monarch, could sufficiently threaten everyone that it would no longer be worth exercising one's natural freedom. So the function of the sovereign here is to create order from chaos. The sovereign solves the problem of private moral judgment by deciding what justice is, what morality is, and then enforcing it. Since we no longer judge for ourselves what's good and bad, right and wrong, that takes away one source of conflict. And since there's order and security, and we know that the sovereign will retaliate on our behalf if we are threatened or if we are harmed, we live in a heightened state of security. So no more competing claims leading to conflict and war. Now, Hobbes is really posing a very different way of looking at political philosophy than Aristotle or Plato, than the classics. For Hobbes, the attempts by philosophers to identify true justice are just not relevant to the enterprise of securing peaceful and prosperous political coexistence. What matters for security at the end of the day is power, a threat of violence that restrains all would-be belligerents, right? All individuals who otherwise would be at each other's throats need to be restrained, and that requires a hierarchy. That requires order, created from above, if you will. For Hobbes, justice is not this ideal of good human conduct. It's a conventional thing. It's created by law, and it's created by convenience, and it's the existence of powers to enforce that law that give justice its shape and form. Outside of that, it's not really anything. My students might say, it's just opinion. It's just your opinion. So, in a state of war, there is no justice or injustice, no right or wrong. In the state of nature, it's not about right or wrong. It's just about survival and whatever you can get. Now, once civil society is established, then you can get justice. Then you can have justice. But for Hobbes, that justice is more or less whatever the sovereign says it is. The sovereign's job is to establish laws that prevent anarchy, and part of that is going to dictate what's right and wrong to people, so people stop squabbling over exactly what true justice is. So now, true justice is a matter of fact, and that fact is whatever the sovereign decrees by law that it is. So justice, in some sense, becomes identical to the justice system. Now, there's an interesting symmetry between Hobbes and Aristotle. Aristotle says that happiness is the supreme political and human good, and it's for the sake of happiness that we value all other things, including politics. Hobbes kind of says the reverse of this, that security is the supreme political good, because without security, nothing else is possible, including happiness. Hobbes is focusing on the minimum conditions for political life, whereas Aristotle is focusing on the greatest goal for politics, on the ideal. For Hobbes, even the rational egoist thinks that death is bad, and so the institutions that preserve life and peace must be good, even for the rational egoist. Whereas Aristotle seems to argue that regardless of what the rational egoist thinks, there is an ideal out there that that egoist should pursue. So for Hobbes, a key point is that order is a precondition to real freedom. This state of perfect freedom and equality is not a good place. It's a bad place. It's a place from which we need to be rescued. We might all be free in the state of nature, but because everyone else is equally free, our freedom is not worth very much. It's basically the freedom to kill and be killed, steal and be stolen from, and so on and so forth. Everybody's at complete liberty, which means no one has any freedom. By comparison, once the sovereign creates order and security, for Hobbes, you gain effective freedom. Yes, you lose some liberty. The sovereign now is in control, if you will. But because you lose that liberty, you're now so much more free to do so many more things that you could not rationally do in a state of nature, because that would have exposed you to too much insecurity. So you're free to save your money, you're free to spend less of your money trying to secure your own goods, and you're free to you're still going to be having to struggle for survival, perhaps, but you're not going to be victim to all the predatory threats that you would see in the state of nature. So under the sovereign, the relative certainty that you will not be killed or stolen from if you obey the law makes it much more likely that you will find it rational to produce rather than steal. You're going to be able to walk the streets without worry. You're going to be able to associate with each other without fear and cooperate with others without fear of treachery. You'll be able to make contracts. You'll be able to plan for the future. In the state of nature, fear and distrust really prevented you from effectively engaging in all of these activities, the way Hobbes sees it. Okay, so that concludes my lecture on Hobbes. Of course, Hobbes is not immune from criticism, and we'll talk further in the course about ways in which this picture of human existence might not be as realistic as one might imagine.